Our next speaker is Simon Rowberry, right here.
Yep.
Who's from the Department of Information Studies at UCL, I believe. And your paper is on the importance of connecting editorial and engineering in teletext and videotext. And in my case, I can remember terms like CFAX. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Robert. So as everyone else has given some background of where they're coming from, I was a literature graduate who ended up falling into publishing and looking at the history of digital publishing. And this question of reading on screen, where there's this kind of dominant narrative of people reading long-form fiction, non-fiction. So I've done a lot of work on ebooks and things like that. But actually, most people do not read most of their content in long-form format. So we have social media and things like that. And actually, an early form of this would be teletext and videotext. So just a kind of terminological difference between those two in terms of how I'm using them. Teletext with a lowercase t refers to the kind of overall service rather than the specific ITV implementation. And that is one-way transmission through the television signal. Videotext, on the other hand, is something like Presto that BT worked on, where it was two-way. And often histories of these formats will focus on Minitel, the very successful French implementation, while Presto is often not considered within the kind of same framework, primarily because of what I'm terming the difference between the kind of engineering prowess and editorial prowess. So in the full paper, I talk through this in greater detail, but the three that I'm looking at, I've gone to the archives of them, are CFAX, so BBC's service from 1972 onwards, Channel 4, Foretel, which is an interesting example because Channel 4 was a new channel, and as soon as it launched, its teletext service was part of that. So it's more integrated into how people consider Channel 4 as a platform. And then finally, Presto as something that built on the kind of strength of BT, but never really took off because of those editorial considerations. So the gold standard that if I say, oh, do you remember teletext to most people, they will say, yes, I remember CFAX. Because it ran for longer than most of these other services, it was supported by the BBC. So it really got the idea of the editorial identity of CFAX and teletext in general. And this is something that's often ignored in terms of histories of innovation, that talking about teletext, it's often the case of, oh, that's not interesting, it was just using the pre-existing television signal and making more of the vertical blanking interval. But overall, it wasn't doing something completely revolutionary. So why should we care about that? But actually, from an editorial perspective, it's how do you use that very low resolution text mosaic to create interesting and engaging content? How can you use the fact that this refreshes over time? There was a lot of creativity, and CFAX can be seen as the kind of pinnacle of this. They understood how the format worked, how to use it effectively, although there were some mistakes because it was a live service. The most memorable one was they announced the Queen Mother's death in the 1980s. So it was very strong in terms of how this was a brand, how we're going to use it to convey information effectively, rapidly, quickly. So we can see this as a kind of proto form of something like Twitter in its broadcast mechanism. So not in terms of its interaction, but very quickly saying, these are the headlines, to the extent where you could have some TV channel that had the teletext CFAX breaking news appear down the bottom of the screen. So you'd get that instant breaking news story that you otherwise wouldn't get on TV unless they changed to another channel about the news. On the other hand, Channel 4 did not own any of the servers. They did not own any of the hardware. They were borrowing the IBA's equipment. And that meant that they didn't have much in the way of engineering prowess, but they had this very clear understanding of how teletext should be embedded within a television service. So they were very keen in terms of, here's the content that we're going to run in terms of TV programming. Here's the content that should run alongside that in terms of our teletext offering. But they were using the same teletext bandwidth as ITV, and similar television stations, which meant that they were in competition with teletext as a service. And there was lots of tensions around, for example, having information about the top 40 singles. And this idea that this was part of the teletext service, so therefore it couldn't appear on Channel 4 because it would eat up their audience and it would limit their advertising revenue accordingly. So Channel 4 never and Foretel were never really successful in terms of long-term success, even though they innovated in things such as digital or electronic storytelling through serializing a cartoon and things like that. So very good editorially, unfortunately didn't have that engineering kind of prowess. Conversely, Prestel did not have that editorial kind of angle to it. The idea that you had far more kind of capacity for lots of businesses, lots of organizations to use this as their platform didn't really work at the time, and because there wasn't that strong kind of cohesive editorial understanding behind it. So unfortunately, Prestel as a service never got to the same space as Minitel. So really this demonstrates that you can't just look at the kind of technical aspects of any of these historical platforms. You need to figure out how it works from the social perspective as well. So that kind of socio-technical analysis of these things will allow you to understand more effectively why this was successful in some cases, but not in others.
Speakers like to come up and join us, please. I think you do an excellent job of highlighting a term, which is one of my favorites, socio-technical. Sometimes it sounds a bit awkward, but it is really meaningful, because where would we be without the interfaces between content and engineering and the technical standards? This is what the world we live in today is about, and historically I think there must be huge numbers of lessons. I thought we could start by seeing whether any of you want to ask each other questions. Is there anything that you would like to put to one of your colleagues to be starting with? If not, I do have one question to get us going, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. And my question is really to ask each of you to talk about the transitions that you've explored in each of your papers, were really significant, both in terms of advancing technology and in terms of business strategy. And I was wondering if you could pick out of those lessons any insight for today's struggles over next generation technologies.
God. These are the big questions,
Yes.
aren't they? One person described TOPS as trying to put a patch on a failing system. British Rail's freight network was facing acute competition from road transport, particularly with the opening of the motorways from 1959 and the increasing reliability of diesel lorries and the increasing size of diesel lorries. So their individual wagon load freight traffic was essentially in severe decline as the top system went in. And I suppose one lesson you learn from this is that you can't rely on a technological patch to solve your fundamental management problems. Having said all that, as I say in the paper, TOPS is still running, but in a much larger form, using packet switching and controlling all of the train networks, in particular. Trust that trains running on the system TOPS is responsible for delay attribution between all the private operators and network rail. So they did make tremendous use of their computing expertise, but that was almost an accident. Their skills developed into other areas and now dominate the rail network. But that's not the original intention. The original intention was to fix wagon load freight traffic, and in that respect, the technological fix failed.
Right, thanks. Ed?
I think our main eye-openers were that our commercial colleagues would come to us and say, we need to do this with this customer. How are we going to do it? And that was always the thing that picked us up and drove us forward. I think certainly, Chris will probably say this as well is that during the early days of the high street network, there was an awful lot of learning about what our customers were trying to do and what their concerns were. And therefore what was important to them, particularly reliability, and when in the year that reliability is important. So it's the case of allowing customer requirements to drive design and technology.
Thanks. I don't have to respond.
But
I'd like to.
no,
I think Chris wanted to.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
I'm Chris Miller, the co-author of that paper with Jim. I think it's worth just mentioning that we weren't being passive at the time. We saw that customers had a problem because they had real difficulty getting sales data back to their centre because they didn't have a nice set of lines with coax wires along them. They were relying on putting tape cassettes in courier pouches or floppy disks in courier pouches. And it was, they were wringing their hands as to what they could do about this appalling delay for their refulfillment cycle. So at that time, people were seeing data networks as a big part of our clients' operation, but they didn't know it yet. So we were simultaneously educating customers about what possibilities were while frantically building the networks out behind the scenes. It was a very, if you like, an aided transition. It wasn't purely evolutionary. It was a conscious decision to see value for the client and grab that as a market.
Do you want to also add something? No? Okay, thanks.
So I think for me, this kind of draws on the previous panel and this problem of these gaps in archives, that if you go to the institutional archives of any of these teletext providers, they have very little direct evidence of their service. But actually, people will be very creative and be able to reconstruct things in interesting ways. So in terms of teletext, if you have a VHS recording of a television program that had a teletext transmission, you can reverse engineer the cassette to actually extract a partial reconstruction of that material. So web archives, some of them might be lost, but there might be some way of reconstructing material in from previous generations. So there might still be hope in a few generations' time of the kind of hobbyist archivists who are extracting the content in interesting and innovative ways. So there might be an opportunity there.
Thank you. And one of the things that struck me when we saw the curve for internet explosion and takeoff, quite often we're told that in internet time everything was disruptive and very rapid, and yet the stories that these histories uncover are relative, not so much that huge exponential takeoff, but a process of learning and sometimes making mistakes, and sometimes correcting for those mistakes, and learning from the United States as well as continental Europe, I think in some cases, but also being innovative in Britain and pushing forward with new services and technologies. And I think that's what's fascinating about these histories and why it really does need to be preserved. And enough from me. I'd like to open the floor to questions to all of our panelists. Yes.
It's not so much a question as a thank you. I mean, I was hoping this would be interesting, but I didn't expect it to be exciting as far as I was concerned. I wrote what was claimed to be the first article in the press about packet switching for the Sunday Times in the late 60s. And I don't know if you know about Ovum reports, and we tracked that. I started Ovum. And then I worked for Logic for a while, with Prestel. I never worked on Prestel. But, and back to Ovum. But just thank you for such a stimulating account from so many different directions.
Okay. Others? Yes.
Can I just link the two, circuit switching and packet switching? And probably, with hindsight, the biggest mistake we made in PSS and packet switching was we were hooked on the idea of creating a virtual circuit.
Absolutely.
Because we had all had circuit switching, telecoms authority knew circuit switching was the way to do it. So could you just imitate circuit switching using packet technology? And that, in a sense, put us years behind what was happening in the US with datagram instead. And so there is an interesting connection between the circuit switch legacy and packet switching.
Yeah. Just a complimentary on that. When was X25 actually finally abandoned?
Not for ages.
No, that's what I
It
thought.
kept running in banking and so on. Chris would know better than I.
I can't remember that. I am not a historian, so I can't remember dates. But X25 was certainly used in several core networks for banking until relatively recently.
Yeah.
Ed, can you remember?
The last time I had anything to do with it would be in about 2014. So it was, I think it was still going on. That was when there were a handful of people who knew about it left in BT, who were in heavy demand. And at the time I was working in the finance division looking at projects, and they were active then. And they would have some very interesting stories to tell you. I think it went on bit beyond that.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because when I was a telecoms director of a big investment bank, technologies that are in the networking field lasts a lot longer than you think. The telex, they're trying to get rid of telex in the 1990s, early 90s, and then along came the investment banking world and they did everything on telex for the next 10 to 15 years.
I think it still goes on. People like Cisco were trying to kill off token ring.
Yes.
But we knew a whole lot of banks who were not prepared to get rid of token ring because they had XYZ application that was written years ago by Fred who left and still needed token ring to keep it going.
But doesn't this make a general point about the fact we know very little about the legacy software that's still out there? I mean, one of the reasons I studied TOPS is because I couldn't get any inside access to banks who have huge amounts of locked up legacy software. So my stepson tells me, who has IT involvement with these, and that TOPS is still running 50 years on, still has elements of IBM assembly language in it. So one almost needs an archaeological dig to establish what's going on in current usage of software. And I'm sure you would find many horizons and layers in any given organisation.
This also, we have a question over there and then Alison at the back and then I could come to you. That's all right?
Yeah, it was just I've got a comment on what was just made, but
Well, in that case, go ahead.
no, as I say, just from the point of view of something that fascinates me is the technological development and the customer aspiration, what the customer wants, because sometimes the two don't necessarily run together. And the point about telex reminds me of the situation in the early 80s. I was responsible within BT International for strategy, commercial strategy. And the world then was divided between voice and telex. And there were two different relationships into the States as elsewhere. And I remember we were looking at something called SatStream, which could provide you with quite fast digital services end to end, certainly from London to provincial, to capitals to the States and so on and so forth. And the top 10 BT customers international at that time, most people ever heard of, they were foreign exchange dealers. And we rolled out a trial so that they could use this, because from the point of view of who knows first, it's important for their transactions. And I always remember that the answer came back, we'll stay with telex, because you've got the answer back. And that gives you a legal contract.
Yeah.
So you have to remember that with all this technological development, there are other things that weigh upon it, and they're not always thought about by the organisation that's providing the service. And there you have to, obviously, once the legal situation had been sorted, telex died a death quite quickly. But that's an interesting piece of industrial archaeology, technical archaeology.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Can I just build on that
Yes,
then?
please do.
Because I had the joy of running telex, it's the best business I ever run. It's about 100 million and everything worked. And it was just being used by people, mostly in manufacturing, all sorts for contracts, was a legal contract, as John said, and for that sort of digital. The point I want to make is it's a bit of a love-in, that I was going to thank Ed, Chris and Professor Norton, because they've kind of having sort of taken on this sort of the lead for the BT core systems that we put up there, and then also to bring in the also excellent other speakers around, of course, circuit switch, because all that pre-work that was done on X25 and on the data networks and the frame relay network then led into the cell stream and core networks, and indeed Colossus IP network. Of course, we were then able to leverage the circuit switch SDN network with dial IP and so on, which, at the time we were still doing 64 kilobits, or 28 kilobits, which is obviously so slow now, but then, and of course, with a copper line into everybody's consumer home, we were able to, so in a sense, we were able to sort of bring these, and it's your point as well made. I think there's a famous quote, is it from The Great Gatsby, how did I go bankrupt? And it's at first slowly and then very quickly. And there's sort of that exponential that you draw on. And I suppose just to pull together one theme and a big thing I'm very keen on, as I've gone through the career, to learn from what's gone on before, all that work that seems in the past was so useful to the ability for us to move forward, and why obviously this work is so important. So not so much a question, but more just a thanks and an observation.
Okay, thanks for that. Rather than ask you to respond, we do have two more questions back there, and it'd be nice to hear from first Alison, I think you're next, and then the woman behind you.
Thank you to the panel. My notes are very interesting because they're about infrastructure, and I wrote down command control, coax networks, and T. And so my question is about the socio-technical, and particularly about T and about work. And I'm curious to hear from the panel about what kinds of work sustained these sorts of networks, and how does the different kind of work that's now expected in our telecom-driven organizations make this kind of networking either very limited in its application or no longer possible. I was also noticing that some of the data processors on your slides were women, and I was also wondering if you had any commentaries about the different kinds of class and gender labor that sustained TOPS, and also CFAX and the other systems. Thanks.
I could give a complete paper on that because I've done a large number of interviews. Let's start with the women. They were predominantly the TOPS clerks who put in the data entry into these Ventec machines. They were called Ventec machines, even though they were supplied by Unidata. Were predominantly drawn on the basis of their ability. So in principle, they were British Rail clerks, but some of the shunters turned out, despite their lowly origins and lack of education, to be very adept at this kind of work. So it was a great opportunity for social climbing, particularly because you got a premium wage rate for working at night. Secondly, there were some women, some of whom were formidable. In fact, I would love to interview them because the comments about them are a bit scary, and I'd love to meet these scary women, but certainly, for instance, an area freight centre in Sheffield was run by a formidable woman, and another one near Peterborough. Predominantly male environments, but where the women succeeded, boy, they succeeded. So a very clear case of upward social mobility, a very clear case of people seizing the opportunity to get into a novel area of work that was better paid, namely computing, and a very strong social structure around those nighttime area freight centres. Does that give you an insight? Lots of young programmers on the top floor at Blandford House in their 20s who had just come out of degree courses at places like the University of Kent with degrees in computing, trained by British Rail at the Grove, sent in to sort out this new computer system.
Yeah, there's not much around the people behind CFAX in the archives or anywhere else. Of course, the news stories weren't given bylines, so the labour is hidden. The only thing within the BBC Britain archives that's interesting is around labour disputes, and particularly the classification of people who input material onto CFAX as journalists and being part of the NUJ and disputes around that. So there's some kind of higher level labour history, but beyond that, it's very difficult to reconstruct who was doing a lot of this work from the archives that I've looked at so far.
As far as BT were concerned in the data networking division, the main contribution from women was in marketing and customer service. We tended to be female poor in most of the areas, but there were a few women engineers that we particularly remember. One with an impossible to write Irish name, Ivan Hopkins, who also played the violin. But we really didn't have that many.
Thanks. And Black?
So this is for Simon. So have you or anybody else who studies this Videotext field looked at the users that have been left behind with services being downgraded and switched off? In terms of, like, in the UK, there's a huge digital divide, so not all of those users would have moved on to the internet or to social medias for that kind of information they're relevant to Videotext.
I'm not aware of anyone working on that, and I haven't looked at it myself, but certainly that is the other big thing about CFAX, that once we got to a certain point in time, every television had the receiver, teletext receiver built in, so it was more mass than kind of early years of the internet. And kind of an anecdote that comes out of some of the stories around this is that on September 11th, it was far more reliable to go to teletext than it was the web, because the Guardian website just collapsed under the strain, while the teletext obviously could deal with as many televisions as possible. So that kind of late/extinct media still was useful up until the point where it was turned off. And then there's that kind of interesting afterlife around when the BBC introduced the digital service with Red Button that never really captured the public's imagination, largely because of that editorial function that disappeared in terms of this more generic television-based web interface. But yeah, I don't know of any researchers in that area, unfortunately.
There's time for one more question. Jamie.
Yeah, interesting. One thing that occurs to me is that what we've heard about is the channels for communication connectivity. It strikes me that an interesting other technical story that might have great implications for the socio-technical side is a story about the growth of memory technology. Because I think that with the internet, we now, I'm minded of a conference that's at MIT where they said all the NASA data was read once only because it was on tape, so deteriorating and could only be read once. And the shift to the internet perhaps is giving us a different type of resource where the memory is a very large part, and yet that's something that's been relatively silent in the discussion we've had.
Any response? Yeah.
I think memory was largely the province of the chip manufacturers, and it became almost a given as you went through. So PCs came with more memory as time went by. It was not always used responsibly. Certainly in communications devices, we needed more memory because we had bigger queues to manage and more sophisticated software. There's an interesting inflection where Cisco went from being completely multi-protocol to actually trying to kill off its support for data, SNA, and other things to focus people on IP, because then it had new services and the memory that the old ones occupied.
To which one's inclined to say, what memory? What was it, 4 megabytes on an IBM 370? They relied heavily on these massive IBM disk drives. I'm sorry, those pictures got edited out. Massive IBM disk drives, which were in advance coming in with IBM 370. Every time they updated, they rewrote the files. So although it was a massive file store, it was updated all the time. There was no memory. So if you wished as a geek to recreate tops, you would actually have to do it from scratch. We've looked into that. You'd actually have to do it from scratch. Yeah.
Any final word?
Well, I think in terms of the BBC and CFAX, they only wanted to keep the data for 2 weeks, so it was very ephemeral and a live service by nature. There were proposals around the 1980s to use video cassettes and other similar formats to actually store lots of content, and then you could just kind of go forward one frame and have a new kind of screen of teletext style material. So there were efforts, but they never really led anywhere.
Organizer, can we go over a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, we have one question back there.
Thank you very much for this. I have to come up with a follow-up to James' question. I spoke to Robert Kahn for 20 minutes last year, and the discussion revolved around memory. So Robert Kahn's latest writings have to do a little bit with internet history, and he's trying to persuade people that it's all about memory and heuristic search and digital object identifiers. So based on this discussion, this question comes to mind: whose memory and for what purpose? Because the 90s turn of the internet was about file sharing and the properties of digital artifacts. One of their key property was that you can reproduce them with exactitude and share them with people. But now we move towards blockchain, unique identifiers, who posted on what time. So I guess I'm asking for reflections on your behalf around this topic.
If you have reflections, can you treat them as your final remarks?
No, what I would say is that this is about the wider data sphere. In other words, the information we were carrying, but neither creating nor interpreting. So for the network providers, that was a limited question. It becomes more important when you think about editorial and other aspects. And certainly a lot of the debate about social media and AI and other factors that drive the wider discourse.
Anything else?
I think that this idea of permanence in any form of the web or anything else is very illusory, and the teletext then what remains is just one further example of why we should have more of an effort to have more substantial web archives and all those sorts of things.
Okay, well, with that, I think I'd like to thank our speakers tremendously. Why history matters, and then some. But I also think our memories of what that history is are often quite different, and they inflect the future. And imagine we heard in the first section about futures as well. I think every one of you has a slightly different idea of what the future will look like, building on current legacy and also new technologies. So thank you all.
So there's lunch outside. Just be back in your seats promptly at 12:45. That'd be helpful. So 45-minute lunch break.
A long career in the IT industry, running major